When I was little, I used to imagine that love was like a sturdy house, strong, unshakable, built to last forever. I thought I'd find my person, build our dream home of love, and live happily ever after. But no one tells you what happens when the cracks start to show. How one bad storm can send the whole thing crumbling. I was 35 years old, a wife, a mother, and something else. A woman who was no longer in love with her husband. Mark and I had been married for 7 years, long enough to see all of each other's flaws and failings. We had 2 beautiful kids, Ava and Liam, who were the glue holding us together, even when we didn't feel much like sticking anymore. We'd both made mistakes. Big ones. The kind of mistakes most people don't recover from. I cheated on Mark 2 years ago. He cheated on me the year before that. We'd fought, yelled, cried, and somehow decided to forgive each other. But forgiveness doesn't fix cracks. It just paints over them. The truth was, I didn't want to be married to Mark anymore. But there was a problem. I wasn't ready to walk away. Not financially, not emotionally, not even logistically. Ava was only 6 and Liam was 4. Divorce would upend their little lives, and I wasn't sure I could give them the stability they needed on my own. So I came up with what I thought was a clever solution: an open relationship. The night I suggested it, Mark was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone while some sitcom played on the TV. I waited until the kids were asleep, rehearsing the words in my head until I finally sat down beside him. "Mark, can we talk?" I said cautiously. He glanced at me, his eyebrows furrowing slightly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I lied. "I've just been thinking about us, about our marriage." His face hardened. He hated these conversations, the ones where I wanted to analyze our relationship like it was some kind of math problem we could solve if we just found the right equation. "What about our marriage?" he asked, already on the defensive. "I think we should try something different," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Something that might help us reconnect in a way." "Like what?" he asked, his suspicion evident. "An open relationship." Mark stared at me as if I'd just suggested we set the house on fire. "An open relationship?" he repeated, his voice low and incredulous. "What are you talking about?" "I think it could be good for us," I said, trying to keep my tone calm and reasonable. "We've both made mistakes in the past. Maybe this is a way to explore what we're missing without giving up what we already have." "What we already have?" he snapped. "Lacey, what do we even have anymore?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I didn't know how to answer him because deep down I knew he was right. What did we have? A marriage held together by guilt and obligation? 2 kids who deserved more than parents who barely spoke to each other? Mark rubbed his temples, letting out a long sigh. "I don't know if I can do this," he muttered. "The idea of you with someone else—" "You've been with someone else before," I reminded him, my voice sharper than I intended. "So have I. This isn't about hurting each other. It's about finding a way to move forward." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he was going to refuse. But then he looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Hurt, maybe, or exhaustion. "Fine," he said finally. "If this is what you want, we'll try it. But I don't want to know anything about it. I don't want to hear names, details. Nothing." "Same here," I agreed quickly. "We'll keep it separate. No questions, no drama." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. And as I walked away that night, I felt a pang of guilt in my chest, knowing I'd just asked my husband for permission to destroy what little we had left. Mark didn't talk about it again after that night, but I could tell the idea was eating at him. He tried to act normal around me, but there was a stiffness in his movements, a heaviness in the air whenever we were in the same room. I caught him sitting in the kitchen late one night, nursing a beer and staring blankly at the table. "What's wrong?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Nothing," he said quickly, but his voice was tight. I didn't push him. I didn't want to hear him say what I already suspected. that he hated this, that it made him feel small and insignificant. I knew Mark wasn't the type of man who could easily detach from his emotions, and the thought of me being with someone else was tearing him apart inside. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he threw himself into work and his usual routines, burying his feelings under the surface. Then Rachel came into the picture. Rachel was everything I wasn't. She was bubbly, outgoing, and carefree in a way that made people gravitate toward her. She lived 3 houses down from us and always seemed to have some excuse to drop by, usually with baked goods or a request for help fixing something around her house. At first, I didn't think much of it. Mark was friendly with all the neighbors, and Rachel had always been a little overly familiar. But as time went on, I started to notice the way she looked at him, the way she laughed a little too loudly at his jokes or touched his arm a little too often. I told myself I didn't care. After all, we had an agreement. But deep down, it stung. When I met Dylan, it felt like a breath of fresh air. We matched on a dating app, and from the moment we started chatting, I was drawn to him. He was confident, funny, and attentive in a way that made me feel like the most important person in the world. Our first date was at a cozy little restaurant downtown. I remember sitting across from him, laughing at his stories and feeling a spark I hadn't felt in years. With Dylan, I felt alive again. I wasn't just a wife or a mother, I was Lacey. But as my relationship with Dylan grew, my relationship with Mark became even more strained. I avoided him as much as possible, focusing all my energy on Dylan and the new sense of freedom I'd found. The arrangement might have worked, at least on the surface, if it had stayed secret. But secrets have a way of coming out. One night, Dylan ended things. "You're amazing, Lacey," he said, his voice full of regret. "But you have too much going on. I can't be part of this mess." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had poured so much of myself into this relationship, believing it could be my escape, my happiness. And now, it was gone. That same week, Mark's friends found out about our open relationship. Rachel had let something slip at a neighborhood barbecue, and the gossip spread like wildfire. Mark came home furious that night, slamming the door so hard it made the walls shake. "You've turned me into a joke," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you know what it's like to have your friends laugh at you behind your back? To be the guy whose wife is sleeping with other men?" I didn't know what to say. I wanted to remind him that this was his choice too, but I knew it wouldn't help. The next morning, he handed me divorce papers. The divorce was messy, as divorces often are. We fought over everything: who would get the house, who would keep the car, how we would split custody of Ava and Liam. In the end, we agreed on joint custody. Neither of us could afford sole custody, and we both wanted to be there for the kids. Mark moved out first, taking a small apartment across town. I stayed in the house with the kids, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Everywhere I looked, I saw the remnants of a life we'd built together and the cracks that had destroyed it. Late at night, after the kids were asleep, I would sit in the quiet and think about how I got here. I thought the open relationship would solve our problems, but all it did was expose how broken we already were. I should have asked for a divorce from the start. I should have been brave enough to face the truth instead of hiding behind a compromise that was doomed to fail. Now, months later, I'm learning to live with my choices. I'm learning to co-parent with Mark, to build a new life for myself and my kids. But some nights when the house is too quiet and the loneliness creeps in, I can't help but wonder what might have been if I had made different choices. They say hindsight is 20/20. I just wish I didn't have to lose so much to see things clearly.